Okay, so with our last little bit of time, I want to talk about the crisis of the church. So this is kind of one of the last things that we could say that happened in the medieval period, and it's kind of the 1100s and the 12 shift. It may be subtle from our modern comparison. It's not quite like the Protestant Reformation that's going to come along later in the 1300s. It's more like things get shaken up, and so maybe it's a prologue to some later shaking things. Well, basically, in Western Europe, which is kind of the part of Europe we're mostly talking about here, we're not super going into the Byzantine Empire and that part of the world right now, but in Germany and Britain and France, Spain, the Roman Catholic Church is a big authority. It is the church, There's not a whole lot of room conceptually for other Christian churches to come along, especially because when they do, they're usually treated as heresies and outcasts from the main religion, or they got to get in line. But unfortunately, having all that religiously concentrated in one institution, there's some logistical. Many are kind of dissatisfied during this time period with the leadership of the Catholic Church. Whether you want to say they were right or whether you want to say they were wrong, there's a lot of fear over church doing, and whether it can get people on its side. Because if nobody believes in the church, and nobody goes to church and nobody, believes whatnot, then obviously they're going to have some problems. Are going to be thinking about the question of how can they get, but also, there are some problems that are seen in the church. This is again something that comes along later when a fellow named Martin Luther and a bunch of people who are calling themselves Protestants sort of break away from the church. But this is not yet the time period for breaking away from the church. This is a time people sort of getting worried about the church and thinking about the church. The problems. Well, if we're being honest, the popes are not, the pope is supposed to be the leader of the church, but a lot of popes in this time period are not really living up to that image. For instance, there's, popes with mistresses and things like that. That's not what we want. That's not great. So a lot of people fear that this sort of spiritual mission has been defeated by wealth and power and luxury. And the Pope does have a lot of wealth and power. People want to donate to the poor. They don't. They do it through the church, and all the sort of money of the rich Roman family went into the church. So the church is a very powerful institution. Now it's very powerful at taking care of people, building hospitals, solving problems when there's natural disasters, stuff like that. But it also just has a lot of money and power. And the Pope is the head of it. Well, he has a lot of money and power. And some popes have used that very well. Some popes, especially in this time period, are not using it very well. So there's a fear of, what are we going to do? Can we get the church back on track? One of the responses is for there to come along new movements, not breaking away, but trying to sort of rise things. And we've got movements that come along like the Dominicans and the Franciscans. These are new sort of groups of monks who have new ideas of wanting to go off and live in monasteries by themselves and rethink the way that people connect to God. One of the leaders in this is St. Francis, who is just sort of one of these amazing figures from history. St. Francis he really believes is to take care of the poor and to be loving and to be kind to people. And he just emphasizes that so much, even when other authority figures in his church, bishops and whatnot, are sort of doubting that. He is arguing for that, and he takes his case right to the Pope. And other things he will do is he has a really stronger sense of nature than a lot of other people. He will talk with brother sun and sister moon and whatnot. And there's stories about him that the birds would give him food and he would just be outside all the time and be this sort of person of love, and that eventually miracles started to happen to him because he was this special kind of person. So his Franciscans, they're all going to be about like living simply and not having a lot of wealth and taking care of the poor and being kind and gardening and things like that. So he has this new movement, and eventually the church decides to get behind this and says, yeah, okay, we'll officially endorse this. And so now there are Franciscan monasteries. So he's a pretty big deal in history, St. Francis. So the current pope himself after St. Francis, that's kind of a sign that he wants to do. So that's like one positive thing he's doing, is having these new movements and saying, yeah, let's have these new movements. One of the more negative things is the Inquisition. So you might have heard of this. It's kind of across the Catholic Church in general, but it's especially big in Spain. This is the time period where Spanish Catholics kick the Jews and the Muslims out of Spain, and also anyone they deem as heretics. So there's a lot of persecution and torture used as a mean to find out if people are secretly heretical or secretly Jewish or something. And so it's a pretty negative time and a pretty scary time. And it has to do with, these members of the church wanting to consolidate their authority by being broad, sort of taking down the people they see as their enemies. But back on the positive side, there's a lot of new philosophers. There's a guy named Abelard and a woman named Eloise who write a lot of philosophy to each other. There's a guy named Thomas Aquinas, who I'm going to talk about in a second. And then back on the sort of more negative side, we have the Crusades, which I'm also going to talk about. But basically, you think of, how would you get the church to all work together? How would you get people to be on your side? If you're the Pope, how do you get more people to be invested in the church and to be more fans of the church and on the team of the Roman Church? One of the ways is that the Pope wants Christians to go against a common enemy. So for a while, the area of Jerusalem has been under control of the Muslims. Well, at a certain point, the Muslim Caliphate. At a certain point, the popes decide Christians sort of band together to take that back, to take it over and make it a Christian area, because it is the Holy Land for Christians as well. This is going to be the start of a series of wars between Christians and Muslims, which are known as the Crusades. And there's sort of negative sides of that. And during the Crusades, there's also a lot of persecution of Jews and blaming the Jews for everything that goes wrong in society. And they must be evil. They must be trying to hurt us. All this bunk, But it's based out of this fear and this sort of idea of uniting Christians against a common enemy. Also, what kind of comes along in this time period is the idea of purgatory. We don't really see it clearly before this. There's, arguments that you can make that it might be a legitimate part of Christian doctrine, but it becomes an official, very clear thing during, basically that before, that instead of just heaven and hell, there's also kind of a realm where people work through their sins with God, usually by sort of experiencing all these punishments. Then, okay, they've suffered enough, they can get into heaven. It's kind of ambiguous back in the Bible whether this is sort of the idea or whether it's more like a permanent hell sort of idea. But it becomes official doctrine right now. And of course, later on, that's going to lead to, you might have heard about this, indulgences. The idea that if you pay money to the church, donate, you can get through purgatory faster and get straight into heaven. Get out of hell free card. Other things that change. There's a lot of mystics and visionaries, people having these sort of visions. There's this woman, Hildegard, who has all these visions. This is a time for revelations and life. So interestingly, they finally decide that priests are no longer allowed to marry. So before this, a Catholic priest could get married, but if you were really hardcore, you wouldn't marry. That would be a way of being pure, but it wasn't something you had to do. After this point, they decide that priests have to stay celibate. Unmarried, unsexual. And I think the idea is to sort of intensify their devotion to God and to sort of, get everybody, the church is going to be more hardcore. That's how we're going to get everybody back together. Okay, so let's talk about these crusades. That idea. I'm just going to put that out there. People used to get all excited about them because it's like, whoa, Christianity versus the infidels and all that. But these days, even if just judged on that standard, they didn't do super well because they sort of didn't really accomplish that much in the long term, and they led to a lot of problems. So, for instance, in the First Crusade, they decide that they're going to go link up with the Byzantines. They're going to go team up with the Eastern Christians, and they're going to use that to help take back the Holy Land in Jerusalem. But think about the kind of people who are going to sign up to join these crusades. Usually they're young men with not a whole lot else to do. Usually they're young men who don't have a lot of wealth. Maybe there's, the second children, so all the farms and wealth went to their brothers, so they're trying to find some wealth for themselves. So this idea they have is they want to seek God and glory and also gold. They want to get a lot of loot and land. They want to take stuff from the Holy Land, not just free it. They also have a very personal, selfish motive in mind. So they're going to, get a bunch of stuff and become rich. That's their idea. And so they get into the Byzantine Empire, and the Byzantine emperor has to tell them, please stop randomly burning down my small towns. Stop attacking my people. You're supposed to be attacking the Muslims, not my people. And so, the leaders can't keep a hold on the young men who just want to loot and pillage, and it's a bad move from the start. And so most of the Crusades kind of go like this. There's another one which called the Children's Crusades, where a whole bunch of children sign up, and a lot of them get killed or enslaved. So that's not good. And in the Fourth Crusade, I think the Fourth Crusade is the most tragic and kind of ridiculous of all. Is that they were originally planning to go take over Jerusalem, and instead these Western Europeans, mostly a bunch of people from Venice, they just decide to attack Constantinople instead. They just decide to attack the Byzantines instead of going all the way to the Holy Land. They just decide Jerusalem's too far away, so let's just loot the Easterners who, we don't get along with them anymore. And the Byzantines are just completely flabbergasted by this. So for a while in the 1200s, Constantinople is taken over by the Venetians, and you can still see traces of Venetian influence in Greece today. And they steal some statues that had been there since the time of the Roman emperors, and they take them to Venice. Not super successful, really, now that we think about it. They have this sort of legacy of this glorious, crusade, it's heroic. But it wasn't really all that heroic if we really look at it. On the other hand, a lot of stories come out of this time period. There's a lot of myths and legends of these adventures. There's a lot of heroes. There's, Richard the Lionhearted and whatnot. So they kind of have an influence on the culture. And they have an influence on the culture in another way, which is this is one of the first times when Christians and Muslims really start interacting with each other in a big way. And so despite the fact that they're warring against each other, when Christians are trying to take this land and settle down, they might marry local Muslim women, and vice versa. When the Muslims take it back, there's going to be contact with Christians, and so on and so forth. So the two cultures really start to interact, which is a pretty significant moment in history. And maybe part of what drives some of the sort of intensity of the church is this feeling of like, we're interacting with the Muslims, we got to be better than them. So on the one hand, it sort of has this legacy of seeing Christian culture and Muslim culture as irreconcilable, as enemies, when they weren't really like that before then. And to some extent today, I think we're still fighting the Crusades on an emotional level, seeing these cultures as different when, in fact, they have a lot in common. But there's some great things that have come out of the cultural contact. Remember how Muslims were, preserving and, for that matter, building on all that Greek knowledge of astronomy and things like that? That comes back into Europe. And on top of that, there's a sort of Muslim idea of romance, of, passionate falling in love and really caring about the other person in your relationship that we hadn't really seen up until now. And that's going to be influential in Europe as part of this tradition of knights falling in love and what we call courtly romance. These knights who have these sort of powerful ladies who they are in love with. That's going to be influenced by the Muslim world. So that's kind of cool. And the last thing I want to mention is this guy, Thomas Aquinas. He is part of this movement of sort of this revitalization of Greek and Roman philosophy that's coming in. What he wants to do is he wants to reconcile Greek and Roman knowledge with theology. He's a monk, and he tries to put these two kinds of knowledge together. So the world is changing. And he really strongly believes you can unify science and logic with faith. And so he's the other big Christian theologian after the much earlier St. Augustine. He tries to give a perfect proof of God's existence, for instance. He says God is a perfect being, and one of the things that is perfect is to exist. Therefore, God must exist. And he's also one of the first people to propose the idea that all creatures were created by God and that the features that they have are because God had a divine plan for them. So we think of that as a kind of conservative thing today, intelligent design, but for him it's kind of a new way of reconciling science and religion. And so he is still very influential today in terms of the doctrines of the church. So he's a guy worth knowing about too. But he comes along relatively late. Okay, that's all we have time for. I will see you guys in the discussion section.